Everybody. So this is lecture 7 for invasion ecology. And the reading to go along with it is Sorte et al. From 2013. And the citation is here. This is a tough paper. It's one of the toughest ones this semester. So give yourself a little extra time. Focus mostly on the figures. You don't need to worry at all about the methods section in this paper. You're really mostly interested in trying to get through the introduction section, understanding the figures, and then a little bit of the discussion. So the topic for this lecture is combining invasive species with climate change. Right? And we've been talking about how bad invasive species are and the ways that species invade, and lots of different case study examples of invasive species that we've talked about this semester. And that's plenty to worry about, right? And think about how we're going to manage this and what the future looks like for invasions. And now we're saying, let's add climate change as another thing that we want to think about, of how these two things interact. This topic actually of combining different forms of global change, and so invasive species are one form of global change, climate change is a form of global change, land use change is turning native habitat into agriculture, into a city or something like that. That's a form of global change. Nutrient pollution, a form of global change. So these are major things that humans are doing to ecosystems on Earth. One of the things that interests me a lot is how those different things interact. So this topic is actually a research topic of mine, an area that that I and my lab group spend a decent amount of time thinking about and trying to communicate outside of things, which means that this lecture has color-coded guides for your outline of topics because it's one that I have given in some formation before. So we are going to talk about rising temperature, how that favors invasives. We're going to talk about range shifting invasive species with climate change. We're going to talk about disturbance caused by climate variability and how that facilitates invasions. We're going to talk specifically about plant response to rising CO2, which is a resource for invasive for all plants, but especially for invasive plants. So we'll start out with that first topic that and this is actually a little outdated, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2013 said that warming temperatures, longer growing seasons are virtually certain. That has not changed, still virtually certain, already being observed. So what happens to species when you have longer growing seasons and warmer temperatures? Well, one thing that happens or that we know about is that warming and warmer temperatures favor more variety and more individuals, so larger populations of forest pests. And that's because most insect pests are ectotherms, so that is, they don't generate their own heat, they rely on the environment for heat. And so if temperatures are warmer, then those insect populations can grow faster and have a longer time period when they can grow. And so you end up with larger populations of defoliating insects, so insects that eat leaves, as well as insects that eat bark and wood itself. And we can see this just sort of empirically. So if you look at, for example, agricultural systems in Massachusetts, and you ask a farmer around here, well, how many insect pests and pathogen pests are you dealing with on a typical crop? They might say, there's a couple of things that I'm treating, that I'm spraying for. But if you ask a farmer in North Carolina or in Florida, how many insect pests are you dealing with? You might get an answer of, a dozen or more. So we know that warmer temperatures are good for insect pests and pathogens, and we know that warming temperatures are coming our way. Another reason that, and so this is forest pests specifically, but could be true of lots of different pests. Another reason that warming temperature can favor these insects is because not only do they have a longer time period to grow a population, the way that they're growing that population is by having multiple life cycles during a season. So if your season lasts for longer, you can have multiple life cycles. That, if you're a mountain pine beetle, for example, allows you to munch more pine and thereby create these die-offs of pine that have been observed for a number of years across the Western US. So the projections of that, these maps on the right-hand side, are that the severity of these pine outbreaks are likely to become increasingly severe, and as those pine beetles are likely to have more life cycles and potentially even overwinter, which allows them to basically get started immediately as soon as it's warm enough, because they don't have to grow from an egg. They're already an adult. There have also been a couple now. So the Sorte paper that you're reading is one of them. There's also the Liu paper from a couple of years ago that have done meta-analyses to look at whether invasive species behave differently than native species when exposed to things like increased temperature, increased precipitation, decreased precipitation. So this was a study, this was a meta-analysis. And again, a meta-analysis is one that takes lots of different studies and puts them all together, which gives you more statistical power to evaluate whether this is a consistent pattern that we're seeing across species, across ecosystems, rather than, we have one study that supports this, but we don't know if it's actually a typical study. So meta-analysis gives you a lot of power. It tells you these are general trends that we're seeing in ecology, and that red circle and the little star next to it means that there's a significant difference in the effect of elevated temperature for invasive versus native plants. So the red is the invasive. You can see a positive effect size, and that little, the edge of your error bar does not cross the 0. So on average, for 20 different studies that they were able to put into this meta-analysis, on average, as you increase temperatures, that favored invasive plants. So invasive plants had a positive effect. That means they did better. In comparison, the native plants did about the same. So you can see that error bar fully crosses the 0 line. So, it's not significantly different from no response. And there is a significant difference between your invasive and your native plants. So as you get warmer, your invasive plants are favored. This one's kind of not really an intuitive reason why, though. So why would invasive plants be favored with rising temperatures? Well, one main hypothesis behind this is the idea of priority effects. And a priority effect is basically the early bird catches the worm, or the early invasive plant gets all the resources early in the springtime. So if you're the first to arrive, this is not just for invasive species, but if you're the first to leaf out in the season and there's no frost that comes along and kills you, then you've got lots of sunlight, you have all that water from the springtime, you've got all the soil nutrients kind of to hoard yourself. That gives you a big leg up in terms of competing with other species that are a little bit slower on the draw. And the key point there is, well, the risk that you take by greening up early is that you are going to get killed by a killing frost, and if we have fewer and fewer of those killing frosts, then the more power to those species, which tend to be around in the Northeast anyway, tend to be the invasive species, more power to them who are able to green up early. Another thing that we are consistently seeing with invasive plants is flexibility. So they call this plasticity. Phenological plasticity is the technical term for this. And phenology refers to sort of the repeated biological events like when the spring green up happened, year after year. And plasticity refers to that sort of flexibility, the ability to shift the timing of when you green up year to year in response to, for example, temperature. So this was from a study that was about 100-year-long study, pretty cool, looking at botanical records that were stored at, associated with Arnold Arboretum, which is Harvard's Arboretum outside of Boston. And they have all of these botanical records and books basically that document, the timing of flowering for various different plants, some of them year after year after year, some of them, here and there during this time period. And so in this study, they were able to see, well, has flowering time changed from the early 1900s to the early 2000s? And in which types of species has it changed? And what they found was for native species, as well as for non-native and non-invasive species, the flowering time hadn't really shifted at all. That those species, they hypothesized, tended to be responding to daylight as their cue for when they would green up in the spring. Whereas when they looked at invasive species, the invasive species, when compared to the natives, had shifted their flowering time back by 10 or 11 days over this 100-year period. So they were much more responsive, much more able to kind of say, hey, it's warming up earlier and earlier. I'm going to take advantage of that because I am responding to temperature, not to daylight or some of these other cues. And that makes these sort of plastic, these flexible species, gives them an advantage with climate change. And it turns out that invasive species, or invasive plants anyway, tend to be those more plastic, more flexible species. So take home point on this one is that invasive species are able to take advantage of this longer growing season, partly by emerging early, having multiple life cycles if they are pests or pathogens, and ultimately outcompeting or causing more damage to native species, which is increasing their impact. See, now you have another color. We're on to orange, right? All right, so the point number 2 that we wanted to talk about was climate change and range shifts. And the idea here is that climate change is happening really fast. So there on this map is Massachusetts in terms of where its climate space was in 1960 or the late 1900s, basically. We are currently in New Jersey or thereabouts. You didn't realize you were actually in New Jersey, but we're in northern New Jersey right now. And we are rapidly headed towards further south in the mid-Atlantic and potentially climate like the Southeast, like South Carolina, by the end of this century under our, keep burning and emitting scenario trajectory that we're currently on. So the idea here is that the difference in climate space between where Massachusetts was and where Massachusetts is going is hundreds of miles, right? And so if you are a species that is living, let's say, in South Carolina, and you need to get to the climate where it's going to be in 100 or 80 years at this point, that means you need to move from South Carolina to Massachusetts, which is really far away, especially if you're a plant or you're an insect, small things that can't move very well. So that kind of begs the question of, well, how fast are native species moving? So here's a study that was done of plants where this was actually done in southern Vermont in the Green Mountains. And in 1964, the Forest Service had gone out and done a forest composition transects from where the northern hardwoods were up until the boreal forest transition, and sort of documented what was the elevation where that transition happened. And so some scientists went back in 2004 and redid those surveys. So we had a 40-year time period, and they found, as you would expect with climate change, that these more southerly species, the northern hardwoods, had moved upwards in elevation as it's getting warmer, and that the boreal forests had contracted from their lower elevations, again, responding to that warming. But the question is how much? Well, over 40 years, they moved about 600 feet, which is not very fast, right? I mean, granted, they're trees, so we have to give them some benefits of not expecting them to move super fast. But at the same time, this is nowhere close to 800 miles that a species needs to move in the next 80 years when it's only gone 600 feet in 40 years, right? So native species not getting there on their own. Instead, what we're doing, what we tend to do, is to give non-native species this big head start, right? We'd like to think that wind dispersal and bird dispersal, could get species around to where they need to go with climate change, but that's not the case. Instead, it's the bamboo that we're planting in their yards. It's all of that macrophyte, weedy material that we're hauling around in our boats from one lake to the other. That's the stuff that's winning in terms of getting that head start with climate change, in terms of already being introduced and maybe even established in the climate space that's going to become suitable with climate change. And so, as a result of this, we are seeing that risk from invasive species is shifting quite a bit. So, just as native species need to move to respond to climate change, our expectation is that invasive species will also be moving in response to climate change. So this is a map with lots of colors and lines on it, but basically what it means is the redder areas are higher certainty that those portions of the eastern US will be suitable for Kogan grass, which is one of the world's worst, on the world's worst list of invasive species, all along the Florida Panhandle and the Gulf Coast. So likely to expand upwards into the mid-Atlantic with climate change. And all the hash marks on this figure are ones those are areas that are currently not suitable at all for this species. So areas that it could not currently establish, but might with climate change. And so lots of new species are likely to be showing up pretty soon. Namely because Kogan grass, despite being a federal noxious weed, there is a sterile, well, I'll say sterile in air quotes, a sterile cultivar of this species that's still widely for sale as an ornamental grass. There are lots of examples. So purple loosestrife is a good example of this, of sterile cultivars kind of unexpectedly losing their sterility and becoming able to grow populations, able to sexually reproduce after being introduced as a sterile cultivar. So if we are already introducing this species as an ornamental in lots of different parts of the US, then that's going to allow it to move way faster than the native species from South Carolina that need to get up here to Massachusetts. I just wanted to include this slide because I wanted to say that this is something that we're working on for the Northeast. So this is sort of an active research area for me. Jenica Allen is a faculty member at Mount Holyoke College who has worked a lot on trying to develop tools that managers and decision makers can use in the Northeast to try to figure out, well, what are the species? What are the plants that we should be looking out for next in the Northeast? Because, there aren't lists out there. Now there are, but previously there weren't lists of, what's coming next with climate change. And then another piece that we've been doing, so this project actually was led by an undergraduate, a UMass undergraduate, May Rockwell Postal, who graduated a couple of years ago. And so for her honors thesis, she worked on taking some of these watch lists for a couple of Northeast states, so Massachusetts included, and trying to go through she went through all of those lists of species to identify impacts of those plants. So did lots of literature review and narrowed these lists down to select number of species that are likely to have the highest impacts in the Northeast. So just some examples of ongoing research that we've been doing here at UMass that are trying to incorporate climate change into the way that we as researchers and as policymakers and as managers are thinking about, what comes next? What should we be looking out for? So take home point on this is that invasive species ranges are shifting, and we actually have a chance in terms of developing those watch lists and prioritizing them and knowing what to look out for. We have a chance potentially to get ahead of some of those, to have some relatively rare wins in invasion ecology, where we might be able to target a species that we know is likely to get here, that we know is high impact if it does get here, and focus on eradicating any populations as they're arriving. But we can only do that if we, know what to look for. All right, on to the purple, which is the idea that climate variability is creating disturbance. So this is a graph of Atlantic hurricane intensity. So clear correlation between warming temperatures and more intense hurricanes, at least in the Atlantic Ocean. That is a pretty obvious large-scale disturbance, but it's not just hurricanes. It's also, peak. So peak year is a term that's used a lot in the kind of climate change world to describe what's happening to precipitation, that we are getting both more intense rainfall events as well as more prolonged droughts like we've had this summer in Massachusetts. And so the combination of both of those essentially creates a disturbance in an ecosystem, not necessarily because a hurricane has leveled the area, but if you have extreme drought stress, extreme heat stress, those can, destroy native plants, so knock back native plants, and that effectively creates a disturbance within your ecosystem. So those extreme heat events, extreme drought events have already been linked to, disturbance to native ecosystems. In the Western US, there have been a lot of documented cases of forest die-off. So one of those, the sort of picture on top is a picture of forest die-off associated with drought and associated with heat events. There aren't actually as many studies of climate change links to forest ecosystems in the eastern part of the US, but the studies that have been published have shown a link between tree mortality due to the combination of pretty severe winter and severe winter in the Northeast. You'd think there would be less severe winters with climate change, but if you lose your snowpack, you actually end up with more severe cold getting to the roots of trees, getting to the base of trees, which can be more damaging than the same cold event would be if there was, a foot or two of snow to insulate tree roots. So this combination of severe winters and hot summers is leading to mortality in trees in the East Coast too. And so why is all this disturbance, this dieback of native species important? Well, because if you lose your native species, then you tend to have an invasive species that's waiting right there to kind of take over because of the increased amount of resources that are available when your native species die back. The figure on the left is is actually kind of a classic figure in invasion ecology, looking at garlic mustard and the link between disturbance. So disturbance is in terms of light availability. So basically, if you knock down a tree, then garlic mustard is happy because it's got some light, and you end up with more density, more stems of the plant in that area. The same thing is true if you add propagular pressure, so you add more seeds to an area, you end up with more plants. But if you do both of those things, so you have a disturbance event and you add, make the propagules available, then you see this big spike in increasing density of garlic mustard. And the picture on the right is kudzu at a forest edge, right? A forest edge is, kind of by definition, a disturbed area, lots of light there, not as many plants to compete with, and wow, is kudzu happy in those areas. So take home point on this one is that climate extremes, so these major disturbance events, extreme heat, extreme drought, hurricane, what have you, are creating a novel disturbance that harms native ecosystems. And by harming native ecosystems, or by harming native plant species especially, you're basically creating an opening for invasive species because nobody's competing with them and they can have that priority effect. They can be the first out of the gate to use up all those light resources, water resources, soil resources that aren't being used anymore by the natives. All right, and our last color is the plant response to rising CO2. So this is a graph from the Mauna Loa Observatory. You've probably seen this sort of seesaw graph before of atmospheric CO2 through time. We busted through 400 parts per million a couple of years ago. We started out pre-industrial closer to, I think, 280 parts per million. So we have changed a lot just in the last 100, 150 years in terms of our atmospheric CO2 concentration. All of this a direct result of fossil fuel burning, fires, basically. So if you remember from intro biology, maybe high school biology, when you go back to this, carbon dioxide is one of the key resources for plants, right? What are plant resources? Light, water, carbon dioxide, that's what they need for photosynthesis, and oxygen is one of the byproducts of that. So major resource for plants. And on the whole, plants do better when you add more CO2. This graph at the bottom is actually from a website that was sponsored by ExxonMobil and the Heartland Institute, describing why CO2 emissions are actually green because this pine tree grows better and better as you add more and more CO2 to the atmosphere. And that's true, the pine tree grows bigger, you end up with more flowers, more fruits, more seeds, larger plants. But the question is, okay, is bigger necessarily better? Is that what we want from our plants? So just in terms of a factoid, one of the things that people who work in forestry and are actually harvesting these trees, one thing that people are concerned about with pine trees growing too fast and too big is that the wood itself is getting weaker and, not as desirable as it was before. And then another issue, right, because we're talking about invasive species, is that invasive species do much better, significantly better than native species when you increase CO2. So again, this goes back to that idea of resources, right? That was when we talked about the empty niche that was related to resources. By adding CO2, by creating disturbance, we are adding resources to ecosystems. What do invasive plants like? They like lots of resources so that they can grow fast, so that they can produce lots of seeds, so that they can compete. They're really good competitors, typically, when you have lots of resources available. So in this sort of top graph, again, this is that Liu meta-analysis. We talked about the temperature before. Basically, what you're seeing is that both native and invasive plants are doing better in terms of their performance. They're to the right of the zero line when you add CO2, but the little star says there's a significant difference between the invasive in red and the native in blue. And so, yeah, native plants doing well, invasive plants doing even better. And so the implications are that as your invasive plants are doing even better, that they can outcompete those native plants, even if the native plants also have an advantage. So this is consistent across the board that when people compare invasive and native plants, the invasives tend to do better. And this is a great study. This has actually been around for a while. It was a study of Canada thistle. And so the two pictures on here are actually, the left one is Canada thistle grown under ambient as of the early 2000s CO2. And the one on the right is future CO2. These are right next to each other, these two plots. And the piece that you don't know by looking at this is that both of those two plots got an herbicide application. So they, by Roundup or something like that, was sprayed on them in whatever the recommended dose is. So under ambient CO2, the Roundup, the herbicide worked. You don't have, except for that one boss plant in the back, for the most part, the herbicide killed the plants. The right side, not so much, right? So as CO2 rises, what happened here is that the plants actually put more growth below ground. So they spent their resources growing bigger roots. And because herbicides target the shoot part, the leafy part of the plant, even if the herbicide was able to kill the leafy part, those plants had enough below ground root biomass that they were able to bounce right back, essentially. So take home point, all plants are doing better with more CO2, but who wins in this battle really matters. And invasive plants tend to be the ones that do the best consistently over and over again. Wow, you guys are lucky. You actually get like take home points at the end of this too. You never get that. So here were our 4 things that we talked about. First is in terms of links directly to temperature, that invasive species are emerging earlier, that they have more life cycles, and that both of those things allow them to be more competitive as climate warms. We see that invasive species, well, I guess all species ranges are shifting with climate change. We are facilitating the invasive species in a way that we are not facilitating most native species. So we're already helping out the invasive species to shift. But because we kind of know what those species pools look like, we know what species are invasive further to the south of us, we actually have an opportunity right now to win, to get ahead of some of them and eradicate them before they arrive, or eradicate them shortly after they arrive. Number 3, that climate extremes, extreme drought, extreme heat, wildfires behind me, right? More intense hurricanes are all creating novel disturbances. The disturbance favors those fast-growing invasives that come in right afterwards. And finally, that invasive plants have a growth advantage relative to natives because of the added resources from higher atmospheric CO2. Super, so just that reminder that it's the Sorte paper that you want to read for class and to check on Moodle for the quiz questions. And I will see you in class.